I'm going to start by telling you a story. It's about a woman named Miss Johnson, Miss Wetherell Johnson. She was British, and her dream was to go to China and teach the Bible through there to Chinese students in a seminary connected to the China Inland Mission. She went in the 1930s and began to teach. She loved the people of China and loved teaching the Bible. When World War II broke out and the Japanese invaded China, in Shanghai, where she was teaching, she, as a foreigner, was rounded up by the Japanese and put in an internment camp, where she spent 3.5 years. Her health suffered terribly, and while she was there, she begged God desperately in prayer all through that time that God would allow her to remain in China and teach God's word. When the war ended, she was released, and she decided to remain in the country and went back to teaching in the seminary in Shanghai. But then communism came, and as it began to spread through China, and eventually it came to Shanghai, she was told that as a foreigner and as a Christian, by being there, she was endangering the Chinese believers. And so she was forced, for their safety as well as her own, to leave China. On her way back to Britain, she stopped in California to visit friends and to spend a bit of time recovering her strength. And she was in the Oakland Bay area near San Francisco. And she ended up living in the US for the rest of her life. She never went back to Britain. She asked God over and over to let her return to China, but she was never able to do so. I'll tell you the rest of her story at the end of this. So, Boaz sets out for the town gate to finalize the redemption of the land for Naomi and to arrange for his marriage to Ruth. The town gate was the place where the elders gathered. It was the place of legal decisions, of settling disputes, of where land sales were finalized and civic problems were solved. So he sits down there and he waits. And the man comes along who is the nearer relative, and with to Naomi then is Boaz, and Boaz asks the man to sit down. Then Boaz gathers 10 of the city elders as they come by until he has a sufficiently large audience to make legal transactions. And then with his witnesses in place, he speaks to his relative. And it says in verse 3, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest you buy it in the presence of those seated here and the elders of our people. If you will redeem it, do so. If you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. Now, this is the first time we're told in the book that Naomi has had to sell her land. She can't work it herself. She has no male relatives to do so, no sons, no husband. She likely needs the money. And the nearest male relative has the right to redeem the land first. The right to redeem it at any time is protected by the law of Moses, unless it's a house in a walled city. Then once it's sold, it's gone for good. But all other land could be redeemed at any time, and the new buyer, the person who would buy it from Naomi, would have no choice but to sell it back to the redeemer if a redeemer came forward. When there is no male left in an immediate family of the one selling the land, the one who redeems it would expect that they would keep it. This keeps the land in the bigger family and as close as possible in the family to the person to whom it had originally owned. And so since there's no descendant of Elimelech to whom to give it, this guy probably thinks that's the situation. He will be able to pay for the land and will be able to keep it, adding it to his own holdings, making money off of it in the future, selling the crops. Good deal. So he immediately says that he will redeem the land. And then Boaz drops the rest of the story. Verse 5. On the day you buy that land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. The nearer relative says, well, I can't do it then. I'll endanger my own estate. You redeem it. What he's saying is that he doesn't have the means to purchase this land and then have to give it to the child that would be born of the marriage. He can't afford to do that. It would endanger his ability to manage the rest of his property. So he refuses to redeem the land. And as a sign of giving up the land, he takes off his sandal. Now, this shoe thing doesn't really make a lot of sense to us. I don't know if if this is what it represents, but it did make me think of God's promises to Abraham. In Genesis 13, 14 to 17, God told Abraham to look north, south, east, and west, and from where he was standing. And God said he would give it all to him. And then God tells him to go and walk the land, for God is going to give it all to him. God also says to Israel when they entered Canaan, go and walk, because everywhere the sole of your foot lands, that I will give to you. So the idea of walking the land is symbolic of possession. For a person, therefore, to take off their shoe might represent, and remember this is just my own idea, might represent giving up their right to take possession of the land. At any rate, Boaz understood what the guy meant, that he's not going to exercise his option to buy the land, so he's giving that right to Boaz. Boaz then declares his intention of buying the land and marrying Ruth in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. The elders witness the transaction and speak a blessing over Boaz. The first part of that is that they pray that Ruth will build his house, as Rachel and Leah built the house of Israel. The second part is that Boaz himself would have standing and be famous. And the third, that the marriage, or that the offspring God would give him through this marriage, would be like Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, the story of Tamar is in Genesis 38, and it's a strange one. But it is a story of levirate marriage, which this one is as well. The child Tamar bore to Judah should have been a levirate marriage, and but she ended up acting like a prostitute and is hired by her father-in-law Judah. The child, Perez, is in the genealogy of Jesus. This marriage, Ruth's marriage, would be similar, a child by levirate marriage. In Tamar's marriage, she was entitled to something that was withheld from her. First by her second husband, who outwardly complied by going through a marriage ceremony with her, but privately refused to impregnate her. And then by Judah, who refused to marry her to his youngest son. In this marriage, the marriage of Ruth, she is given something to which she is not entitled. Boaz is not the brother of her first husband and is not required to marry her. He does so as a gift to her and to Naomi. So it's two strange marriages. Both women and the resulting child are in the genealogy of Jesus. So Boaz marries Ruth. And in verse 13 it says that the Lord enabled her to conceive. This may indicate that the fact that she had had no children by her first husband was due to barrenness, a problem on her end, and perhaps God had actually even withheld children from her in her first marriage, and so that he could bring her to this place. If she had had a child before in her first marriage, she would not have ended up in the genealogy of Christ. But the Lord gave her a child now, and it is a son. And that's exactly what they had hoped for. A son to inherit the land, a son to care for them for the rest of their life. When the child is born, the women of town actually bless Naomi. Again, a bit of information from the Jewish traditions taught by the rabbis. They teach that Boaz actually died himself between the marriage and the conception of the baby and the birth of the child. There's an odd bit of wording in verses 14 and 15. I'm just going to read those verses. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will redeem your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." So the person being named in that passage as the Redeemer is the child. They say that the child is the protection for Ruth and Naomi. So perhaps Boaz had died, but the birth of a son meant that the land was his, and so too was the income that would provide for them. Now again, this tradition is not biblical fact, and we'll have to ask Boaz when we get to heaven if he died before the child was born. I thought it was interesting what the women said about Ruth. Your daughter-in-law who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. What a statement. Sons were the epitome of what a woman could could bring to a family. It was the greatest treasure there was to have sons. Naomi thought she'd come back empty. She had no sons, no husband, and she certainly, when she came home, did not think her daughter-in-law was better than the 7 sons, because she complained bitterly about her lot in life. But through Ruth, she now has a child, not a blood descendant of her own son, but the one who will carry his name into the future. Naomi becomes nanny to the child, and the people say Naomi has had a son, and he's named Obed. He is the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David, who becomes king. I wonder if Ruth was still alive when the teenager David, her great-grandson, was anointed king of Israel by Samuel. God is clearly at work in this chapter. He arranges for the closest relative to say no to redeeming the land. He opens Ruth's womb and causes her to have a son. And God takes his blessing of Ruth to extremes way past what she could ever have dreamed. When she was in Moab or walking to Bethlehem with Naomi, she could never have imagined that she would marry again and have a son, let alone that her husband would be wealthy and show her such kindness, nor that her great-grandson would someday be anointed king. And beyond what Ruth could ever see, God did even more. He put her story in his word for us to read and study thousands of years later. He put her in the genealogy of the Messiah, the Savior of the world. He made a Moabite widow with no hope, living in deep poverty, an example for us. God made her famous. And God did more for Naomi too than she could have imagined. She wanted the names of her husband and of her sons to be preserved, but I doubt she ever thought we would be studying her story all these centuries later. God's blessing goes way past what we can ever imagine. It's going to amaze us, I think, when we get to heaven, to see what God has done through us in ways that we could not see or conceive. I think much of what God will do through us and how he will bless us will not even happen during our own lifetime. We have to trust God for that and believe that he is not done blessing, not done producing fruit, even when we are unable to see it or are not here to see it. Now let me finish the story of Miss Johnson. She was living in California, still praying that God would let her go back to China, when 5 women from her church came to her and asked her if she would teach them the Bible. Miss Johnson was actually pretty disgusted. She said to God, I don't want to do that. There are Bible studies everywhere that these church women could go to. I want to go back to China. But God's answer to her through his word was not to despise the little things. And so she began to teach these women. She told them she wouldn't spoon feed them. They would have to do homework and then get together and discuss what they had learned on their own through the passage before she would teach them anything. In a very few number of weeks, the study grew from 5 women to 20, and then it outgrew that house and grew to 50. And pretty soon she was teaching 4 nights a week in 4 different locations in the Oakland Bay area. And there were so many people that every study was full. Then some of the people from those studies began to move, and they went to Indiana or Texas, and they begged Miss Johnson to send her notes, her teaching materials to them in their new homes so they could continue the study. And they began to gather groups in their new cities and to continue studying together. Within a fairly short time, it was suggested to Miss Johnson that she could incorporate this. And so she began an organization called Bible Study Fellowship. And I am a participant in a BSF class in Surrey 60 years later, a class with over 400 women in it. And today, 500,000 people study the Bible through BSF. But that's not the end of what God did. In 1984, Miss Johnson died and went home to heaven, never having had an opportunity to return to China. A couple of decades after she died, BSF classes were opened, first for expats in China, but eventually also for Chinese nationals. A man who worked for BSF headquarters was the director of international classes for them. His first name was Chuck, and he went on a visit to China to visit the classes in Beijing and Shanghai. There were no big churches, of course, in China for classes to meet in, and so the classes usually rent a conference center at a hotel to meet. And so he visited this hotel where he visited a women's class in Shanghai. He was encouraging the teaching leader and listening to the struggles that they were having and trying to get a handle on what the international classes needed. On his last day there, he decided he wanted to visit the place in Shanghai where Miss Johnson had been interred during the war by the Japanese. He knew the name of the camp, and so he asked a taxi driver if he knew where that internment camp was. The taxi driver said, well, I know where it used to be, but it's not there anymore. It's been torn down, and there's a big modern building on the site. And Chuck said he didn't care. He still wanted to see it. So the taxi driver wheeled him around through the streets and pulled up in front of a big, huge hotel. And he points to it and he says, where that hotel sits is where the camp used to be. And it was the same hotel Chuck had been in the day before, visiting the BSF class. Now, had Miss Johnson returned to China, she would have perhaps taught a few hundred students. But through the organization she began, several thousand people study the Bible just in China alone. And as I said, over 500,000 around the world in over 120 countries. I think God put that class on the exact same piece of ground where Miss Johnson, while she was a prisoner, begged God in prayer to let her stay in China and teach the word, so she could see that he had heard her prayers, that he knew her dream, but he had bigger plans for her dream than she could ever have envisioned. And it came a long time after she had gone back to heaven. And that's how God blesses. It's always bigger than what we can imagine, and it might even come long after we're gone. Ruth wasn't anyone special. In fact, quite the opposite. She was an outsider. She was poor. She was insignificant, but she believed in God. She was faithful where he put her. She stepped forward when he asked, and he poured out a massive blessing on her life. Miss Johnson wasn't really anybody special. She was obedient, and she had a heart for God and his people and his word. We don't have to be anyone special either. Just believe by faith, accept God's redemption, and be faithful to his call. And he will pour out a blessing that will blow our minds. Where are you struggling to accept a no from God? Will you trust him to be planning bigger and better things than you could ever dream of on your own? I hope the book of Ruth helps you to look for God's providential care in your days, appreciate his redemption, and anticipate his blessing. He blesses lavishly, and I pray it's given you a renewed understanding of what God has given us in redeeming us. We are the poor in spirit. We are in need and without hope. We are the outcast, the foreigner, but God takes us in, willingly paying the high price of redemption on our behalf. And we are blessed beyond measure, beyond what we ever thought it could be when we first became a believer. And God will do so much more that he tells us that it is beyond our capacity to imagine. I hope Ruth has given you a greater gratitude for your redemption and for God's blessing on your life.